Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
But let's begin with this horrible story. The question I'm going to ask you at the end of one of my interminable introductions is a pretty straightforward one. I think I'd... Well, I don't want to upset you, but I think I'd give priority to you if you've seen it in real life, as opposed to in newspaper photographs or television footage. I speak of the blackened carcass that is Grenfell Tower, looming horribly over a corner of London that speaks of so much relevant to where we are now. It speaks of social division. It speaks of, I think, possibly social exclusion. That's one of the conversations I want to have this hour. Because it does seem to me, the more I look at it and the more I hear from you in other parts of the country and other parts of London, it does seem to me that kind of notion of deportation of the poor, getting poorer people out of certain parts of towns, is real. I mean, even with my sort of liberal credentials, I've always been a little bit wary. I've always thought people were possibly exaggerating, but I'm getting too many examples now to resist the idea that there is a desire in some quarters to see a form of social apartheid unfold. And there's proof of it, I have to tell you. There's proof of it in the environs of Grenfell Tower. There's proof of it in that part of town and other parts of town. Somebody told me yesterday what the word is that the councils use to describe these processes. So what happens is everybody's invited to move out while an area is refurbished. And then they are ideally not invited to move back in again. So here is a little exchange that one of the people who's kind of whispering in my ear about these issues from within an organisation, which is why they can't go public themselves. They say the word they use, do you know what the word is? The word they use is decant. People will be decanted. Can you believe that? People will be decanted from one building into another, from one part of town into another. And the plan is, after the refurbishment has been undertaken, that they'll stay where they are. A single decanting is the dream. That's the phrase they use. Well, ideally, there'll be a single decanting, as opposed to a double decanting, which means they move back in again. So I haven't yet been able to stand it up completely, but I'm hearing several reports that in that part of North Kensington, some of the residents have been offered a sum of money to move out, and then if they wanted to move back in again, they'd need to have roughly double. So you get a sort of, not quite a compulsory purchase order, but here's £450,000 for the property you've lived in for 20 years. You move out because it's social housing. Even though you've exercised your right to buy, it's on an estate that can be developed. You want to move back in again, you're going to need to find about £800,000. I'm just looking into all of this. And then, almost by coincidence, I was reading at the weekend about St. Catherine's Dock, which, for those of you who don't know, is I think it was the last big marina space, the last big dock to be built on the Thames. It's certainly the easternmost dock on the Thames. And it is... I think 1827 it was built. Just a little bit of trivia for people who enjoy such things. All the rubble that they dug out of St. Catherine's Docks when they were building it created what is today Pimlico, because Pimlico was marshland, or a lot of it was marshland. So all the stuff they dug out of St. Catherine's... You like stuff like this, it's not just me, is it? I love this kind of bit of interest, and God bless them. My daughters still enjoy these sorts of trivias. I don't know how long that's going to last for. So all the rubble they dug out of St. Catherine's Dock to create berths for yachts and boats is what they put down on what was the marshland of Pimlico, so that they could build on Pimlico. But 11,000 people. So I know it's in 1827, but I am increasingly worried that we seem to be turning into a Victorian Tribute Act in Britain at the moment. 1827, 11,000 people were forced out of their homes in that part of East London. It's not even East London, actually. It's practically next door to Tower Bridge. And none of them were offered compensation. So, I mean, in some ways you could argue we've made some social progress, but I can't help thinking that the mindset of municipal planners, authorities, governments, councils, the mindset that could even contemplate moving people out of their homes in 1827 and not giving them any compensation, they'll be all right, they'll find somewhere else, we just need to decant them. I'm very conscious of possibly being a little bit exaggerated myself on this one, or being a little bit scaremongery. I just hear an echo of that in some of the stories surrounding the decanting of poorer people from wealthier parts of towns in this country. If you've got something to say about that, I'd love to hear it. It's not the question that I'm starting with today, and it's not a question I fully sort of finessed. I'd love to just hear examples of it, where you honestly feel, I mean, rightly or wrongly, but your instincts tell you, or the facts support the notion, that you are essentially being socially cleansed. They're trying to get you out of an area. I heard a lot of that from people when we were in North Kensington last week, when we were at Grenfell. The suggestion that people were that these areas get gentrified, and they hate the fact that they've still got these whopping great tower blocks in the middle of them full of relatively poor people. And you sort of see evidence of it. I think Wandsworth Council had a problem lately. I know there are other... Anyway, you'll tell me. Just this idea, because it doesn't get reported. Or if it does, it'll be on page 18 of The Guardian, and hardly anybody gets to page 18 of The Guardian of a morning. It might not be necessarily the scoop of the century. It may be that you can sort of put the tale to bed and explain why there's nothing to see here. But too many people said to me last week that the Grenfell Tower tragedy was emblematic of broader, scarier truths about social cleansing. And you remember Emma Dent-Coad, the Labour MP for the area, telling us that the deputy head of the council, now gone, was recorded at another meeting up in Scotland, saying the village doesn't dictate to the estate. Again, a very 19th century attitude. The village doesn't dictate to the estate. The ludicrously monikered rock-fielding melon was responsible for that intervention. He is, of course, the former deputy leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council, who played a part in freeing up a former library for the use of a local prep school, at which both of his children have got their names down to attend. But there's nothing to see here. I've been looking into some of these reports of the council. There's nothing to see here. His argument was that because he'd quite publicly admitted that he had his kids' names down at the prep school, which had been, under very favourable terms, awarded use of a previously public local library, because he was open about the fact, then there was no suggestion at all that it was dodgy dealing. So that's one approach, I suppose, to transparency. But I'm interested, really, first and foremost this morning, not in the social cleansing question, which I hope we can move on to, but I can't do anything with that unless you help me. I've got nothing else to say except this deep suspicion and a lot of anecdotal evidence from people that if and I'm looking into it, if it turns out to stand up to scrutiny, it's going to be a fairly grim indictment of our era, our age. But to begin with, Grenfell Tower itself. This is a nice newsletter. There's an awful lot to criticise the authorities for, but they seem finally to be getting it right. It's the 20th edition of the Grenfell Fire Response Team newsletter. This presumably is part of the purview of the squad sent in by Sajid Javid. A little late, but, better late than never. And if they've already issued 20 editions, it does speak of a determination to keep the local community up to date with developments. So I'll tell you what the latest is. Despite the intense heat of the fire, the structural concrete frame of the tower is stable and poses no risk to public safety. This has been confirmed by a range of experts, including structural engineers. Residents are told you will continue to see lots of activity on site over the coming months as the police recovery operation and investigation inside the tower continue. That's grisly stuff. We've covered that in the past. We will no doubt cover it again. The area surrounding the tower continues to be cordoned off. This is why some of our guests last week, like Thomasina, had to be rehoused even though they weren't living in Grenfell Tower at the time. This is both to keep the area safe and to ensure the police investigation can continue without interruption. And then there is an explanation of the safety of the building being enforced by a sophisticated system of on-site alarms, which can be detected. They detect the tiniest movements caused by gust of winds, temperature changes, shifts in the building as heavy material is removed. They're really finally keeping the public in the loop. And the biggest question of all is this one. Come November, the building will have been shored up with steel supports. Scaffolding will have been fully erected around the carcass of the building to allow debris, any remaining possessions, although God knows there won't be much, and other material to be removed. And they'll put up a cover in stages as successive floors are cleared. I don't know what the cover will look like. I don't know what it will constitute, and nor perhaps do they, because here's the final paragraph of the front page of this newsletter. No long-term decision on the building will be taken until survivors, their relatives and local people have been consulted. We realise the sensitivity and strong emotion that activity around the building can provoke, so all work will be carried out with residents' concerns at the centre of our considerations. I mean, you don't have to be a resident to hold a view on this. You just have to have a functioning brain. What do you think should happen? In the immediate aftermath, when we discovered those accounts, the documents that had actually been written by the council leader, former council leader Nick Paget-Brown, talking about the aesthetics of the area and explaining in black and white text how a large part of the refurbishment process was to improve the view from nearby buildings. Not the only part of it. I haven't yet been able to establish how the cladding benefited the people living on the inside of the building, but certainly we know that there was no argument at all that a large part of the process was designed to improve the view on the outside of the building. It sort of speaks of a very strange worldview to spend millions of pounds improving the view of rich people, which could have been used to improve the living conditions of poorer people. But hey, it's Kensington and Chelsea. They also gave £100 rebate, of course, to every council taxpayer in the borough, while electing to cover that tower block in cheap and flammable material. But in the immediate aftermath, I found that story, that particular element, when we found the evidence of it in the planning announcements and in the PR that they put out to boast about the deals that they were doing, I found that so utterly repellent. Even the idea that it was part of the expenditure, I found it so utterly repellent that in a very childish and somewhat pathetic way, I was drawn to the idea that the building should be left as a charred carbuncle to ruin the views of these people. But there are two things wrong with that. The first is there's no evidence at all that the people living in the smart areas particularly desired the building to be covered in cladding. There'd be some snobs down there, of course, but most people in that part of town where I used to live actually quite enjoy the economic diversity, the socio-economic diversity of the area. And there's nothing wrong with making an ugly building look prettier. It's just where that is on your priority list is the problem. And of course, the other issue with my slightly childish response is that it looks at the issue from the wrong end of the telescope. It effectively looks at it from the point of view of the council decision to spend money on making it look nice instead of making it nicer to live in. It doesn't recognise whatever the people who did live there will be feeling now. I told you the thing I found hardest last week was the children walking to school, because we got there quite early. And I don't think I don't know. I don't think they should be walking to school in that shadow. You know, our friend Shah, his brother, who is not well, he suffers from schizophrenia and is due home soon from an overseas trip. And the family are desperately worried that he is going to see from his home the carcass of the building in which his mother and his aunt perished. And that seems horribly wrong. And yet, in the short term, there's nothing the council can do about the building itself. So, what do you think? What do they do? Do they? I mean, any answers at all to that question? What do you think would be the most appropriate treatment of that building come November, when they will be moving towards a sort of final decision? Just tell me what you think. Bring in as much as you want, as much of the politics, as much of the people, as much of what you've heard on LBC or picked up elsewhere. What should they do with Grenfell Tower? Bearing in mind that the uppermost priority has to be, doesn't it, the neighbourhood and the residents rather than the broader political picture. You will get through. Hit the numbers now. 0345 6060 973. What should happen to Grenfell Tower? Now, I think it's a rather even more complicated question than I realised when I asked it. I say that because of the sort of diversity of answers that are coming in. Millie in Orpington suggests that Grenfell Tower be demolished and a memorial garden be put in its place commemorating all of the deceased. I guess, and yet there will be people who are very conscious of just how valuable that real estate is, and not being cynical about it. It could still, of course, be used to provide homes for the kind of people that were living in the tower in the first place, people who could never dream of buying a place in those postcodes. It needs to be taken down with a memorial put in its place, like the Twin Towers is another suggestion. Here's an interesting one. I think the building should be used as a training centre for a national volunteer force used to organise events should there be a disaster of any kind. That sums up something so profound for me, that suggestion. The idea that because every single time I shook hands with and felt humbled by some of the people that have stepped up to the plate in the aftermath of the tragedy. I had this little voice in the back of my brain shouting, they shouldn't have had to. So I agree with you on one level, but on another level, I don't want a national volunteer force. What am I paying my taxes for, if not to provide relief, cover and support in the event of tragedies and disasters? So what should happen to that building or to that site? Nigel's in Islington. Nigel, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning, James.
Hello.
I mean, as a retiree who worked alongside a guy who was an expert in tower blocks in the 70s, 80s, I mean, looking at it now, it's. I think one of your emailers has beat me to the idea of a memorial garden. Quite frankly, I mean, the land. You're right. The land value there would be considerably high, but I just think the whole thing is so horrific that
Do you think a garden would serve the purpose that perhaps people feel needs to be served, which isn't just a commemoration of the dead, but obviously we await the results of the inquiry before we can speak with absolute certainty, but there does certainly seem to be a case to answer on the part of the council. What are we going to call it? We could call it official incompetence or official negligence. And a garden, I don't know, possibly camouflages that side of the story?
Well, I think basing it on what is happening in housing generally across London here, on my estate here in Old Street, I mean, the developers are looking at every possible site. Let's kid ourselves. There is the privatisation of council estates going on in London. And I went to a recent lecture at a place called The Gallery, where a woman who'd done thesis on, she was an expert doing studies on high-rise living, said that 67 council estates across London are under threat from demolition.
Well, this is the other side of the story that I want to hear about today. People who have been effectively told that they have to move out of their home, either temporarily or permanently, and what deal is in place for their relocation or their return. Because it's not a section of society that have a very loud voice, which is making me begin to worry. As you say, if there are 67 estates, that's an awful lot of families, an awful lot of homes, and not an awful lot of effort being put into ensuring that they either come back quickly or have somewhere desirable to go. I look at that. If anyone wants to ring in with examples of that, I shall take them. Thank you, Nigel. I worry with the garden. I hope this is an acceptable conversation, because an awful lot of people who live in the shadow of the tower, or people who've had to move out, will not be ready to even think like this yet. It was another lesson I learned last week. They're just too traumatised. It's one of the reasons why the offers of rehoming have not been taken up on the scale that some newspaper commentators who've never been near the place think they should have been taken up on. You get a phone call, well, you're still, you know, your children are still officially missing. So the number of bedrooms in the property that you've been offered, you can't even think about it, because to accept the 3-bedroom or the 2-bedroom when you've got 4 kids, 2 of whom are missing, you just can't go there. So an awful lot of people in the area won't be ready yet and may not be ready in November to answer the question of what should actually happen to the site. But I wouldn't want it to be, whatever is done, I wouldn't want it to avoid the potential malfeasance of the authorities. And just even not the potential, the fact that they were warned this was going to happen time and time and time again, and elected to completely ignore the warnings. I think that has to be, what's the right word? Not commemorated, just remembered. How do you properly commemorate the victims of the fire without letting the people who may be proven to bear responsibility for it off the hook? I don't know. It's a grim question. Barry is in Stockwell. Barry, what would you like to say?
How you doing, James?
All good.
Basically, what I'd like to say is I believe they should cover it to save the heartache of a lot of people, but at the same time consult with the people who used to live in Grenfell, the people who live around it, and the campaigners and all the helpers about covering it and what they reckon. And in the long run, rebuild it. If you can have a garden beside it, no problem, with some plaque commemorating the people. Rebuild it. Make this be government funded, not private developers. Rebuild it. Have a mixture of rich people, because who will buy the place if it was privately built by private investors, with rich people and poor people, showing that to celebrate the idea that we are supposed to be a diverse set of people who do care about people. We know we don't really, but just as a thing so we can say that we can. I'm being honest.
I love you, mate. So let's do something that allows us to pretend that we're not quite as callous and as selfish and as greedy as we've learned in the last couple of years that this country has become.
But that's the reality of it, because this is what we always have token stuff. But at least, you know, so they can say, you know, we're going to show you guys that we do care. You're not scum. And I think one of my last points is make sure we learn from it, James. Make sure we learn from it.
That's the phrase I was looking for when I was talking to Nigel. The idea of a garden or a proper memorial, that is all well and good and important, of course, but that phrase, to make sure we learn from it, how do we do that? What can you put in place that constitutes the lesson that must never be forgotten?
James, I'm going to say this, and you can say it better than me. You're very good with English. I'm learning from you, actually. My children had a problem at home, because when I started listening to you, I started to say, you need to speak properly, but I can't myself, so they was laughing at me.
You're doing all right. Don't get too discombobulated.
but basically, what I think they should do is from by learning from it, make sure the people who don't have a voice have a voice.
Yes.
Make sure. So if they've been complaining for years and you haven't been listening to them because you see them as you said, the village doesn't dictate the state, let them have a voice. The states that you're smashing down and you're kicking the people out and saying, oh, we have no choice. Look, James, it's going at an alarming rate. And you know this famous thing when they say politicians don't care? My mum told me this growing up.
Yes.
The first time I ever voted in my life was this one here. And my mum has been right.
They don't seem to care unless they're forced to care, and even then you can sense the reluctance that is sometimes employed as they bring themselves into the into the public arena. Some of the interviews given, or the one interview given by the new council leader, was, for my money, an exercise in that. Barry, thank you, and thank you for the kind words. That's the point. How do you commemorate the dead and ensure that lessons are learned from the system of events that arguably contributed to, or at the very worst analysis, caused those deaths? It's 10:30. And if you can, give me some examples of social cleansing, or what you think might constitute social cleansing. There's the Battersea Power Station one, isn't there? Where, in order to do the deal, they promised to include a certain amount of social housing. And now they've said, we can't. We need to reduce massively the amount of social housing that we were going to provide. And I forget what the precise figure is, but the projected profits for that development run into the hundreds of millions of pounds. But we can't afford to keep our promise. It's almost as if they just sort of did a nudge and a wink to Wandsworth Council. And everybody knew all along that it was never going to happen. But in order to get the well, what's the story? In order to get the project over the line, they all pretended it was. I could be wrong, but hey, you need to come up with a better explanation. It's 10:31. So I don't think this is pie in the sky, okay? But I also don't know how to dig into the phenomenon. So I was right about Battersea Power Station. It's a £9 billion revamp, which was supposed to include a significant number, over 636 of so-called affordable homes. And they've just announced a reduction in that figure to 386. That's a 48% reduction from the original plans. The original plans would have been used by the local council, in this case Wandsworth, to persuade the local people that this was a good adornment, a good addition to their neighbourhood. They would have been targeted at local residents, first-time buyers and renters, with a 40% discount promised to locals on the average market rent. Now, just allow me a moment here, because you know what happens sometimes, don't you? Is that we start on a story, and I don't know as much about it as I should when we begin having the conversation, but I learn as you do during the course of the hour, and then within that hour I'm ready to start punching things, because they promised local people a 40% discount on the average rent in this development, and they promised to build 636 homes in that affordable category. They wouldn't all be for rent at a 40% discount, but a significant proportion of them would have been. And then, as completion nears, or as the development continues, they just simply announce blithely, and with no apparent comeback at all, they just announce that actually we're not building 636 homes in the allegedly affordable category. We're going to build 386. And that's actually disgusting. That's absolutely incredible. And this was announced on the 21st of June. So it was announced in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell Tower. Yeah, we don't need to build 636. And the council must. I don't know how this works, the relationships between councils and developers, but the relationships must be a lot more interesting, shall we say, than people like me naively believe. So what does the council do? And what's the final profit? A few of you are telling me that you've got a figure of in the region of 1.8 billion could be the overall profit on a deal like that. I'll triple check that, but it's certainly not going to be peanuts, is it? So they said, no, we can't give the homes to the local people who won't be as rich as the people living there because the size of our profit, our epic 9-figure profit, might be slightly dented. And you think that possibly there's an exaggeration when that phrase social cleansing is used? Sarah is in Caen. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hello there, Jane.
Hello, Sarah.
I'm just calling to provide some further anecdotal evidence, really.
Is it anecdotal or is it happening to you?
It is happening. Well, it's happening to me, but because I'm a non-resident leaseholder,
right.
I'm kind of one step removed. So
Okay.
basically, I'm a leaseholder on the Central Hill estate in Crystal Palace.
Yes.
That's a unique 70s development. It was actually designed by an award-winning architect. We found out 2.5 years ago that they're planning to demolish the estate.
Okay. Why? Do we know why? This is Central Hill in Crystal Palace.
Well, they said that they could get more density on the estate. So basically, this is a mixture of low-rise maisonettes and
Yes.
a few blocks of about 4 stories high.
Okay.
So they said they could get more on it, basically.
Well, there's some sense in that, isn't there? I mean, if they put in 6-story blocks or change the 2 stories into 4 stories, they double the amount of properties or the amount of homes provided.
Yes, I mean, if they were going to keep it all as social housing, I think that would probably be more justified. But this particular development has an amazing panoramic view over the city skyline.
Right, so it's posh.
This is just, well, it could potentially be amazing if they were to new build, penthouses, you'd have this amazing view. So basically they want to steal the view from us mere mortals and sell it on to people who could perhaps pay double the price of what they're willing to pay off. So I had to find out just from a news alert from the Architect's Journal that I got through my work.
Yeah.
I just found out that's the way I found out the estate was going to be redeveloped. And
So what happens to your flat?
well, basically, I've got a maisonette on the estate, and what they've said to us is that because we're non-resident, so because
So you're a landlady, are you?
Well, I let the property out now, but we lived there for nearly a decade, and then because of my husband's work,
Yes.
he moved out here to Wiltshire.
Fair enough, and you didn't want to surrender your foot on the London property ladder because you'd never get it back on again. So you rent out the flat to tenants.
Yeah, eventually we did, yes, because we couldn't sell the property, and also we didn't know what was going to happen in Wiltshire. And we're Londoners essentially, so we wanted obviously to move back eventually.
Sure.
I think we would have done, but we were told then, after a lot of smoke and mirrors type communication with Lambeth Council, they then said to us, well, you're non-resident, so you don't have the right to return at all, even if you could afford to buy one of the properties which are double the price of what we're willing to pay you. So we're basically
just rewind, because that's exactly what I heard in North Kensington last week, and I didn't quite understand it. One fella told me we've been offered £450,000, but we'd have to find £800,000 to move back in again. Is that what you just said to me?
Yeah, this is what. So we were given some.
I don't know what to say yet. I'm just sorry. I'm just going to have a sort of belch of fury, if I may, because I don't understand how this is happening in my country, and no one's cross about it.
Yeah, I've been so looking forward to you covering this subject because I knew eventually you would.
Sorry, I'm late.
I'm straight on the phone. As soon as I thought, that's it, James was talking about this, I have to ring, because basically a lot of estates like Central Hill are suffering very badly and they're not getting the publicity. But obviously, us people, we can't afford legal funds either.
Or PR companies or publicists or campaign managers or whatever else they're spending the council tax money on.
That's right, they're just residents who are giving up their free time to do sort of stalls on...
So give me the numbers, They've told you that because you're a leaseholder, you're not a resident, you don't have any right of return, but everybody who owns a property on that estate is going to have to sell it to them for a price they set?
Yes, that's right. So all leaseholders, whether you're resident or non-resident, will have to sell back to the council. A few people ditched their properties at auction and made a, really bad loss, basically.
Yeah,
some people just had to go because it was so stressful. So what they said to us about 2 years ago, they sent us some figures. And I thought, at last, we're getting somewhere with this.
Yeah.
They did a generic valuation across the whole estate, and they said, these are the kind of figures we're looking at. And it was just ridiculous. They said, basically, a 3-bedroomed property on the estate, they'd be able to buy it back off us for, I think they said, between 250 and 300,000.
Yeah.
And then I looked across, and there was another column of figures for the the new build version of the same type of property, and that was 575 to 600,000.
Okay, so you are being told that you cannot keep your home, they're knocking it down, in order to, you believe, with some evidence, flog the view to the highest bidder.
Yes.
They'll give you, let's say, 300 grand for it.
Yes.
Which you put in the bank and find somewhere else to live for the duration. But if you want to move back into leaving aside the fact that you're not resident at the moment, it could have been you're the only home you've ever known for the last 20 years.
Exactly, yeah.
And if you want to move back into that postcode, that part of town, that actual land that you thought you owned, or at least had a leasehold on, you'd have to find £575,000.
Yes.
And that is the end of this conversation. That is literally what you have been presented with.
Yeah, that's right. And I've been fighting it for 2.5 years. I've tried my best with very limited resources. So, yeah, this is basically where we're at. And it's actually made a lot of people ill.
Of course it's made a lot of people ill. And in fact, the more vulnerable, frail or elderly you are, the more likely you are to be brought low by this.
Yeah, it's been really awful, and like I say, we've got no legal funds. Like London Council have got the
There's
whole
nothing you can do, is there? I mean, legally,
no.
I don't know what. I mean, we're going to have to look into this a lot more, and because I don't think, as you've, I think, possibly implied, this is huge, right?
Yes, it is.
And it's going on all over the place, and it's essentially social cleansing. It's social cleansing.
Yeah, and these, we've got no option now, but we will have to stay where we are. And if we
Wiltshire,
stay here, we won't be going back to London. That's for sure, because we won't have anywhere to go back to. So, any potential career or anything's all finished. And also, I haven't got 300,000 to put in the bank, because obviously I've got a mortgage.
Yeah, so you pay off your mortgage and you're left with, and it's a lot harder, of course, now than it was when you bought the place, because of changes to mortgages and deposits and the shifts in the property market. So yet again, the people, oh boy, can you keep me in the loop? Will you email me the latest?
Yeah, I would love to do that, because
Thank you.
I'm just so grateful to you today, James, for bringing this up.
Well, I didn't know that. I'll do my best. I'm not, Professor Dumbledore, but I just have this horrible feeling. This is what I learned last week, and I'd heard whispers about it before. I've got a friend in Ladbroke Grove, but she's a bit of a hippie. I've got to be honest with you, and I haven't been paying that much attention to what she's been telling me, but I think she's in a very similar situation. And yet she is a resident, and she is actually a freeholder, which is rare in the square she lives in, and she might be the sort of the grit in the oyster. She could prove to be the one resident who refuses to do what the council are telling her. But if this isn't social cleansing, what are you going to call it? People who can't afford a £575,000 property. I don't know whether you want to call them poor or not. It doesn't seem to me to be a definition of poverty not to be able to afford a £575,000 property. But they don't want people who can't find a 575 grand mortgage living in this area, despite the fact that they've lived there for 20 years. And what it means, this doesn't speak of, lead swingers and layabouts, that ludicrous tabloid narrative of scrounging or Skyver versus Striver. This is strivers. This is people who have played by the rules, people who have signed up for the social contract that's been for sale in this country for the best part of 40 years. And they've kept their side of the bargain, and now they're being told, sorry, you can't live here anymore. You just can't. You can't live here anymore because you're not rich enough. And up and down the country, the sort of forelock-tugging, feudal, British, tabloid, brainwashed people will be going, well, yes, absolutely fine. People should know their place. The village can't dictate to the estate. Stay with me, please, because I think this is really important. It doesn't happen very often, does it? But occasionally you just get this sense, even though we're live on the radio, that we're just... Because when stuff doesn't make sense, you know what I'm like? I'm like a dog with a bone, and it's beginning to make sense now. There was trauma behind the rejection of some of the offers made to the Grenfell Tower survivors. They weren't ready. And I know that it is also important to remember how easy it was to persuade certain quarters of this country to start hating people who'd survived that fire. Even now, I find those words a little bit dispiriting. The speed with which people could be encouraged to turn on them, because a handful may have been undocumented migrants, or some of them may have been subletting properties. Therefore, they somehow deserve to die, or they deserve to lose their homes, or they deserve whatever hovel the council throws up for them. But behind that argument, I was a little bit confused about why some of the offers perhaps had not been accepted. And the reason I was given and didn't fully grasp was that they didn't think they'd be able to move back. Now, I don't know what sort of links you have with the area where you live. I don't know how close you are to your neighbours. I don't know how fond or familiar you are with the amenities. People move home all the time, but usually with good reason and because they want to, right? The reason why a lot of these people don't trust this council and the rehousing offers is because they have got a history of trying to get poor people out of the smarter parts of town. And the people that survived the Grenfell Tower fire are generally at the lower end of the socio-economic scale, even if they owned their flat. Because we've just spoken to a lady with a flat in Crystal Palace, and my inbox is going nuts with identical and similar stories in different parts of town. I want some from outside London if you can find any. I'm being inundated now with identical examples where they come in and they say, right, everyone has to move out, we're redeveloping the estate, we're buying it, we'll fix the price that you get. You don't really have any choice. It's as close to a compulsory purchase order as I can imagine. And if you want to move back in again, you'll have to pay around double what we're paying you for your old place. And of course you won't be able to get a loan for that, because the market from when you got your mortgage for your original flat has changed beyond all recognition. And that to me, of all the conversations we've had on the programme together, apart from the ones that involve life and death, this to me is the most powerful proof yet that my slightly frenzied fears that we're heading back towards a 19th century distribution of wealth are bang on the money. And speaking of the 19th century, in 1827, 11,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes in where St. Catherine's Dock now is and offered no compensation whatsoever, which sounds like a story from a bygone era. But there's not that much difference. If that's your home and you're not going to be able to afford to move back into your neighbourhood afterwards, yeah, you've got a couple of $100,000 in the bank, maybe $50,000 in the bank after you've paid off what's left of your mortgage. So it's better than the experience in 1827. But it's the same experience as in 1827, just with a little bit of compensation instead of none at all. And we're just letting this go on our watch, unremarked, unreported. Why? Well, partly because we've been conditioned now for 20 years not to care about people, not to care about each other, and partly because local news journalism has dropped off the map completely. Jackie is in Orpington. Jackie, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Yeah, I don't know if you know the Haygate estate of the
Elephant and Castle. Yes, I do. What happened there?
There was over, I think it was roughly around about 1,200 properties, masonettes, flats, homes. Everyone was moved out. Over the course of a period of time, the Elephant and Castle shopping centre, they had it up on the top floor. Yeah. They had a great big area, and they were showing you the new layout of what the properties were going to look like. And the plan was that they were going to build this development, regenerate the area, as they call it, and they were going to build 600 properties that would go back to social housing. In total, I think they built 3,000 luxury flats. The cost, the so-called use of what the councils and what the developers say is that they've overrun on their budget. So what's happening is that they can't allocate the 600 and so flats to social housing because of the costs and the profit loss. Yeah. So what happens in accordance with the councils is they agree that they said, OK, what we'll do is we're going to give 85 properties over to social housing.
So 1,200 moved out and 85 moved back
families, in? Individual people in flats, homes. Okay. They were all moved out of the area. And it went on for about 2 or 3 years. You'd go up to the shopping centre at the Elephant and Castle. You'd go inside and they'd say all these people in suits and all the rest, selling the store in that.
Nothing wrong with suits, Jackie. Let's not get suitist. We've got enough on our plates without becoming suitist.
Let's have a blue-collar suit rather than a white-collar suit, James.
That's a boiler suit.
You get more common sense in a blue-collar suit than a white-collar suit, don't you?
No, you might be right. Go on.
And you might be treated more fairly by a blue-collar than a white-collar. But yeah, so that's what's happened at the Elephant and Castle. So there's, I think, 3,000 luxury flats. 85, I think, roughly around 85 are going to...
Do you know, I tell you what, I told you this was a tip of an iceberg because I'm already receiving messages about the estate you're talking about, and the final figure was actually 82.
It was like, I was 3 hours. Sorry about that.
Hey, well, don't phone me up with your figures all up the spout like that, madam, all right? If it's 82, I want 82. None of this 85 malarkey with your suitist agenda.
Well, maybe I was being a bit generous. Maybe I was thinking that developers might hand over free poppies to social housing. And also, James, it's the councils. The councils don't care. The reason why the councils don't care, Why are they going to be wanting to be keeping the upkeep of the council estate when you've got rich middle-class people, not just from this country, from all over the world,
Yes, of
who are
course.
buying properties, who can afford, the middle classes who can afford to buy in London. It's the working classes who have been forced out of London. You've got middle classes coming from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Europe, everywhere you can imagine, even the Middle East, Asia. All the middle classes are buying up London.
And a lot of them aren't even living in the properties.
They're not living in the properties. No, but that's what I'm saying.
But here's the thing. All right, just pause for a minute. Pause for a minute. Was it you or was it someone you know that was living there?
No, it was a cousin.
And where did
an auntie who was living there. She was moved out of her property. She lived there for a...
Where did they move her to?
It was built. Sorry?
Where did they move her to?
One was being moved out to Shropshire, and the other
Shropshire?
Yeah, and one was moved to... my auntie was moved to down to Borough.
Okay, so Borough's
She was kept locally
still
to the
in
area.
still in Southwark. Because here's the thing: the rationale I could construct if I had to, for doing this, would be that the council needs the money. The cuts have kicked in, and they're trying to raise money in whatever way they can. Developing property that they own is quite a good way of doing it. But if the people that live there are moving out of the borough, then that argument becomes utterly ridiculous, because they're supposed to be raising money to look after the people that are living in the properties that they're developing, and they're not. They're selling them, as you quite rightly point out, to people who've never paid a penny in council tax in that area before.
Exactly, but then people are moving in, even if people aren't living in the buildings, James, the council haven't got to worry about the upkeep of those buildings. It's private developments. So it's down to the person who owns the property. So all they're doing is they're taking
All
the
right,
revenue in.
okay, try this on for size. Try this on for size.
Go on.
What percentage of flats? It was sold off by Southwark Council. It homed 3,000 people before it was knocked down in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of flats in the new development do you think was sold to an overseas investor?
Say that again, the last bit, sorry?
What percentage? As part of the regenerated area,
Yeah.
the first sort of tranche, 51 properties, what percentage of those do you think were sold to overseas investors?
I would have said about 80%.
You'd be wrong. Try again.
99%?
No, they reckon all of them. They reckon 100% of them were sold to
Really?
foreign investors, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, James. And it's not just, it's the elephant, it's happening
The
everywhere.
South Gardens. South Gardens in Elephant Park. OK, now, I feel a bit embarrassed not to have been better across this story. Why do you think it's failed to get the coverage that the injustice would ordinarily demand?
Because the government doesn't want it, the councils don't want it. The councils are just making money from it, James. They're selling off the land.
But they flogged it off in total in 2011, and they almost certainly didn't do a very good deal, because one imagines that the final profit that's gone to the developers will dwarf what they paid for the land, and they're not. I think by law they're not allowed to develop it themselves. That goes back to the 80s.
The same thing about all the hospitals that Labour sold off for Christ's sake. I mean,
this isn't party political, is it? Because there'd be councils of every hue and cry that fit into these categories.
They're all the same, James. It's all about profit. It's all about profit. It's not about caring in the community or looking after the people. It never has been.
Okay, here's the killer. Here's the killer, Jackie.
Go on, run it by me, James.
They spent £44 million clearing people from the estate, Southwark Council.
Yeah, go on.
And guess how much they raised?
Go on. I don't want to guess.
50 million.
Oh, you're joking,
I'm
mate.
not.
So by the time they take the admins out of it and the bungs and the backhanders...
Steady on, madam.
Below that, isn't it?
Steady on, madam, but yeah.
Well, I do try to be stick fairly, you know.
This is. I mean, I like you because we can talk about it with a smile on our faces, because the alternative is just to start gnashing our teeth. I'm going to stay with this for a little bit longer. In fact, it's possible I'm going to stay with this for the rest of my career, but I mean, in the short term, I'm going to stay with this for a little bit longer because, well, the affordable 82 flats that were provided under the terms of that condition went for an average value of 800 grand to 1.5 million. They're the affordable ones. As we continue, thanks to, for want of a better phrase, the Grenfell Tower tragedy, unearthed just how much social cleansing is underway in the City of London. If you're experiencing similar elsewhere, then please, I'll keep a couple of phone lines free for stories from outside the capital. But remember, what happens here generally filters through to the rest of the country. I am, unfortunately, rubbish at sums. So I've heard now from Wandsworth Council, and it is, as we reported, the number of so-called affordable homes in Battersea Power Station was reduced last month significantly by about 40% because the developers are worried that the projected £1.8 billion profit may not be quite as big as originally hoped. Council have been in touch with us to say that the £1.8 billion figure being widely quoted in the media refers to a viability study written in 2008, which is now years out of date. So although, no doubt, some costs have gone up since 2008, I'm thinking that the cost of property has gone through the of roof since 2008. So they're seeming to argue that the 9 years of exponential property rises that we've seen on the London market may somehow reduce the profitability of a project to build hundreds and hundreds of flats. But the sum I'm not very good at is this. The coverage also does not make any reference to the... I'll tell you something here. Come here a minute. I'll tell you what Grenfell Tower has taught me. Grenfell Tower has taught me not to trust a flipping word these people tell you. They throw out the numbers, they throw out the figures, they throw out the shiny pants PR releases, and they just presume that we'll all be too stupid or too busy or too, I don't know, conflicted and too caught up with hating on each other to actually bother looking at it ourselves. That's what I've learned from Grenfell Tower. Do you know they were publishing glossy newsletters, the TMO, the Tenants Management Organisation, which effectively featured the 4 people that were employed by that Tenants Management Organisation on salaries bigger than the Prime Minister's, cutting ribbons and shaking hands and giving interviews, to the publication that they published themselves about how wonderful they were. So I look at this now. This has just come in from the council. 215 million quid. The coverage also does not make any reference to the 215 million pounds which the owners have paid towards the new tube link. So the biggest bit of evidence they've got, the 2 biggest bits of evidence they've got to challenge the idea that a 1.8 billion pound profit is in jeopardy. They're saying, oh, well, costs have gone up since 2008, which seems to me to completely ignore the realities of the property market. And also, they've paid £250 million towards the tube. I'm rubbish at sums. I think this is 11%, but can you tell me what percentage? 215 million as a percentage of 1.8 billion. Can you just do that sum for me now? I appreciate that this isn't normally how radio works, but hey, this is never how radio normally works. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. Rachel Venables has been doing more than pretty much any journalist in the land to keep the Grenfell Tower story alive and to keep the connection with that community in place. She is there today, and it was you, Rachel, that broke the story about November being the date at which the cover-up process will have been completed. How are people in the area responding to that news?
Well, they're responding, James, with a lot of confusion, either because they don't believe the building should be covered up itself, or because they think that November is, quite honestly, far too little too late, as it were. I spoke to one woman earlier this morning who's an actual resident, and she says, quite frankly, both the scarring image of the building, the impact it's had on her mental health, and the physical impact of the dust and the remnants being blown out of that building and into the surrounding areas. She says the damage has already been done, and waiting another 4 months really isn't going to make much of a difference. Over the last hour or so, I've been around some of the surrounding areas, the really residential streets, where if I just turn my back on the blackened ruins of the tower, it just looks like a totally normal London road. And the people I've been speaking to here tell me they really don't think this building should be covered up by the council.
I think it should be up there. I'd be interested to know what kind of residents would like it covered up, whether it's the residents from the immediate area or whether have been affected, or from the sort of smarter parts, if you like. Yes, so I think it should be there. It's quite striking.
And to get all the evidence
but
that
why
they need.
cover it up if it's there? Everyone knows it's there. If it's there, it has to be there. If it's not there and it's pulled down, that's a different thing. But covering it up and concealing it when everyone knows it's still standing, I think is just masking the obvious.
I think it's a bit of an insult.
Hiding it. Yeah. It's hiding something that is there. And I also think there's sort of... It reminds us of certain things that shouldn't be forgotten as long as it stands. And I think by hiding it and pretending almost that it's not there and sort of, beautifying the landscape is wrong.
Well, I kind of agree with my dad, what my dad said, that you should take it down, but then still have a place where you can remember the people that have died in the
fire.
Yeah, in the fire in the tower.
Absolutely, and it does stick out. I was looking out the window last night and you saw an amazing, beautiful sunset, and there was just this incredible juxtaposition between this beautiful sunset with normality around, and then this really quite harrowing image that kind of, portrays a story, and yeah, it's really quite something powerful.
I think one of the most interesting points was made by the woman you heard quite early on, James, where she described covering up this building as hiding something that's there. That word hidden, even the phrase, of course, covering up, is something that's been at the heart of the debate around Grenfell Tower pretty much since the fire started. But certainly the people I've spoken to say that as horrific as it is, as scarring as it is, literally up into the skyline, it needs to be there because every time you walk past it or you drive past it, you're reminded of what happens, and that leads people to want to ask questions, to want to keep finding out really what happened there.
You're describing the opposite, aren't you, of that old adage, out of sight, out of mind. They worry that if it's out of sight, it will soon be out of mind.
Exactly. That's what many of the people spoke to me about. But then, of course, the reverse is the mind of the people who are so scarred by it, the people who every time they look up, they don't see the smouldering ruins, they see the fire, the tower on fire. People possibly, could be triggered by this. This could cause PTSD. So they are the two sort of polar opposites, really, of the argument here, and that's what's being balanced when, whether it's the council, the fire brigade, whoever it is who's made this decision, have decided that by November they're going to have put up scaffolding, and then floor by floor they're going to block off this tower.
Well, we will put it neither out of sight nor out of mind, and I'm very grateful for all the work you've done in ensuring that our listeners know that for certain. Can you do me one other favour, Rachel, today?
Of course.
Just have a little dig around with that thing that we heard from Joe and others when we were there on Wednesday about being offered £450,000 to move out of their homes, but having to find £800,000 if they ever wanted to move back in again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. It's 10 minutes after 11, although given the contents and the speed of my switchboard at the moment, I might not need Rachel to do that from an actual journalistic point of view, because the so-called case studies are coming in thick and fast. If you're just tuning in, this is weird, okay, because I knew it was going on some level, and I am a bit of a bleeding heart, or whatever phrase you want to use to describe somebody possessed of a conscience. I knew it was going on. I just didn't grasp the scale or the impact or the truth of these stories. Speaks a lot about the crisis in journalism in this country at the moment. What are we writing about today? What's on the front pages? Daily Mail's obsessed with the idea that some students might have voted twice in the general election. Meanwhile, people are being forced out of their homes on an almost endemic scale and prevented from moving back into the same area after the previously council-owned property has been redeveloped. Again, there's a little bit more to the Wandsworth response to complaints about a retrospective removal of a provision for so-called affordable housing. The escalating cost of restoring the power station building means this entire development project is facing significant challenges, and the committee had a very difficult choice between accepting a potentially lower number of affordable homes or refusing the application and risk losing all of them. So I don't know about you, but generally, if you tender for a contract, right, and you do your sums wrong, or circumstances change and it turns out you're not going to make quite as many billions as you thought you were going to do, then you as the developer suck it up, right? No, not if you're doing a deal with Wandsworth Council. If you're doing a deal with Wandsworth Council, the developer doesn't suck up the dent in the profits. The local people hoping to get their hands on a home at 40% less than the usual rental in that part of town, which will be among the highest in the country, they're the ones that have to suck it up while paying their council tax. And would I have got quite as cross or indeed as confident that I'm reading it right before the Grenfell Tower tragedy emerged? No, I wouldn't. 12 minutes after 11. Kunwar is in Sidcup. Kunwar, what can you tell us?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call. I'm a little bit nervous.
Don't be. It's only me. I'm not cross with you. I'm not cross. Do you run Wandsworth Council or Kensington and Chelsea Council?
Well, I'm glad I don't.
Well, then you're all right. I promise you. Carry on.
Thank you. I'm calling about basically the Townless Council is planning to demolish two housing buildings, residential building, high-rise building. One of them is about 7 stories, another a few stories, in just a few minutes from Liverpool Street, on the back of Valence Road, the infamous Valence Road. And the residents were told in 2013 that these properties will be refurbished.
Right.
At the cost of $25,000 per property to the leaseholders because they were a bit dilapidated.
So the leaseholders have to find £25,000 each?
That was in 2013.
Yes.
Now,
and is it former? Is it? I mean, the leaseholders will have exercised right to buy, so they were formerly council flats, or are they private residences from the get-go?
No, they were social housing council flats.
Okay, so the £25,000 per property for the tenants who have to move out, that'll be paid by the council. For the leaseholders who've exercised right to buy at some point over the last 30 years, they've got to find the money themselves.
Absolutely.
Okay.
However, in the last week or so, they have been told by the council that 25,000 has gone up to 120,000.
Well, I'm taking all your word for this. So I'll stress that
I'll give you full reference. The report is on the cabinet agenda for 25th of July council meeting.
And which council is this?
Tower Hamlets Council.
Tower Hamlets Council.
Right. Now, not only that it has gone up, they're saying because it's far too much money to renovate a new refurbished building to bring, which they should have done ages ago, we have to demolish these buildings.
And where does that leave the leaseholders?
Well, they haven't been told. Either we'll pay you some sort of a money, some sort of a,
So they've spent, just to be clear, they've spent 4 years worrying about raising £25,000 to stay in the home they thought they'd already bought.
Correct.
And now they've been told they're knocking it down anyway. Wait and see what you're going to get instead.
Well, on this excuse that the cost has gone up from 25,000 to 120,000.
And because no one can afford that, we're going to knock the whole thing down and start again.
Exactly. Who's in their right mind will have 120,000 sitting in their bank?
I don't know anyone. Not anyone living in a flat in Tower Hamlets. I mean, I can think of a few people off the top of my head who could lay their hands on 128 grand without breaking a sweat, but they'll be the ones that are investing in the development companies, not the ones living in the actual flats that are being knocked down.
That's correct. Now the other interesting issue is the Crossrail is coming to that part of Tower Hamlets.
Yes.
Town, yeah. Not far from. And the developers are very much interested in this gold mine.
Of course they are, because that's going to open up. I mean, the property's going to go up according to the accessibility to the centre of town. Of course it is.
I was speaking to someone who's lived there for 40 years, 39 years, Gloria.
In that block?
And in that block, Trevis House.
Yeah.
Now, she thinks there's no way they can stay in that property because they can't afford 120,000, the council is demanding, but on the back of that excuse, they want to demolish it. Residents don't even know whether they will have a roof over their head or they will have to just take whatever the council is offering them, wherever they're offering, if they're offering it. They don't know anything. And suddenly, without any consultation, the item has appeared on the cabinet agenda for 25th of July.
Right, stay on the line and give Caroline the reference for that, will you? And then we'll get a call into the council and find... Go on.
Point is that the residents are meeting today in Brady Arts Centre to protest about this.
Well, you know where I am. Keep me in the loop. Let me know what's going on. I can't wave magic wands or anything like that, but the first step of dealing with apparent injustice and apparent unfairness is getting it out there. And I can help with that. 17 minutes after 11 is the time. Kumar, thank you. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 22 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC as we continue to reel, really, from the... discovery's not quite the right word. Confirmation's probably closer. That social cleansing is alive and kicking and underway in almost every corner of the capital. It'll be happening elsewhere in the country as well, but I've heard from Brixton, I've heard from Crystal Palace. We already knew about North Kensington. We just heard from Tower Hamlets. There are barely a borough. Wandsworth, of course, Battersea Power Station is just the developers of that. It's essentially a Malaysian consortium worried that their profits aren't going to be as huge as they hoped, so they've reneged potentially on the, BNP, the Bank National Paribas, one of the banks involved in the scheme, has said there's very little chance of the 250 extra affordable homes promised ever materialising at the end of the scheme. So they've miscalculated the profits, partly because the pound has tanked and partly for various other reasons. But in 2008, according to the council's own release that they've just sent to us, they estimated a profit of £1.8 billion. Now, in every other corner of the country, property's gone up in value since 2008, but somehow, because of the tanking pound and miscalculations on the part of this Malaysian business consortium, Battersea Power Station is the only property in the country that has materially deteriorated in value in the intervening 9 years. Incorrigible FCA is a mischievous soul, never more so than when he is squirreling away with his abacus, and he's done a calculation on what the average increase in property prices has been in that 9-year period and what it would mean for Battersea Power Station. He's looking at an average, it's a percentage change in that 9-year period from 2008 to 2017 of about 61.1%, which means that if they did the, what's the word they used, the viability study now, theoretically it'd be closer to the £3 billion mark, but it isn't. It's gone down, which is why they don't have to build as much social housing as they promised they were going to build. I have to tell you, and it may be that my pendulum swings again on this, but as I read the release sent over by the press officer at Wandsworth Council, I read it in a very different way from how I would have read it 2 months ago before Grenfell Tower went up in flames, because I've read the stuff that Kensington and Chelsea Council was putting out when it announced, for example, the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower and devoted more lineage to the aesthetic improvement it would affect in the area. In fact, one of the releases that went out, whether it was from the council or the developer, I can't quite remember, only mentioned the aesthetic improvement to the area. The idea that wrapping a building in cheap, flammable cladding would somehow improve the quality of life of the people living inside is beyond satire, isn't it? I mean, it's beyond parody. Yes, it's like a Bird and Fortune sketch. So what are we going to do to improve life for these poor people? We're going to wrap their flats in cheap, flammable cladding. Oh, splendid. They'll be ever so grateful. They'll be tucking their forelocks as we ride by in our carriages. We're going to do what? We're going to wrap it in highly flammable and cheap cladding. Oh, and how does that make life better for the people on the inside? Well, it means that their rich neighbours won't look down their noses at them quite as snootily as they do now, because the building will look a bit shinier and it won't be a concrete carbuncle. So you're spending billions of pounds, not billions, you're spending millions of pounds to effect some changes inside that residents have already said render their lives less safe, and big changes outside that are effectively designed to improve the view. Yes. Oh, O'Brien's just talking nonsense again. Where's he getting his evidence from? Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea press releases. Oh. So that's why I read press releases from Wandsworth Council with a rather different eye from the one I would have employed 2 months ago. And what that eye tells me is that the 250 affordable homes that they are planning to renege on, is a nod and a wink. It's almost as if it was never intended to happen at all. What do we have to do to get this past the planners? What do we have to do to get this past the public? What do we have to do to get this through? Well, I don't know. Let's promise to build lots of houses for peasants. Okay, yeah. Do we have to keep that promise? Nah. We'll start wriggling soon as the tide goes out. And that's what wriggling looks like. And that's why people that did live in Grenfell Tower do not trust Kensington and Chelsea Council to rehouse them, because they want to stay in that area. And we are hearing story after story after story of hundreds, nay thousands of people forcibly removed from their home areas and priced out of returning. But what are we getting cross about today? What's the Daily Mail telling us to get cross about? Students who may have registered in 2 constituencies during the general election, and no real evidence of it yet, except a couple of posts on social media. But just ring up a patsy on the Tory backbenches and get him to fulminate furiously about how outrageous this is, even though he's never heard of it until the Daily Mail have rung him up and has absolutely no evidence at all that it's ever happened. That's what we should be getting cross about today. Not people like Gloria, who Conmar just told us about, lived in that same block of flats for 40 years in Tower Hamlets, now not knowing where she's going to go. And the councils are doing it to raise money, and the councils of every political colour are doing it to raise money, so you can't score party political points there, I'm afraid. You possibly can when the councils explain why it's so important that they do raise money in this egregious way, and that's down to cuts imposed by central government. 27 after 11. Sorry. Back to Sidcup. James is there. James, sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a mad one, and there's not a great deal of time left, but do your best to fill it.
It sounds good to me, James. Just very quickly, about 12% was your sum, the one...
That's, yeah, 12%. This is their fig leaf saying, no, we've also contributed money to a tube station. I'd like to see them flog the flats without the station being there.
Yes, absolutely. On your viability, it is a con. Most local authorities and even the mayor are frightened of developers, frightened of saying no. And I've been there. I've actually produced viability statements and assessed them. The fact is, I mentioned to you about the decanting time for Grenfell of up to 2 years. One of the major issues was actually the leaseholders. I mean, I'd like to go into a little bit of detail with you, but I doubt I can cover it in...
Come back after the news.
Sorry?
Come back after the news. I've just remembered who you are. You know of what you speak in this field, don't you? And presumably you're sitting there thinking, if you're feeling charitable, you're listening to this programme thinking, well, better late than never, James. And if you're not feeling charitable, you're thinking, you muppet, it's taken you long enough, hasn't it?
I'll stick with number one at the moment.
But then I'm definitely coming back after the news in that case, and I'll take a few more calls on this as well. James is a former, he worked in precisely this sort of field and took the responsibility for that dreadful word decanting residents from big estates nearer to where he is in Sidcup than where I am in Leicester Square today, and so he knows exactly what he speaks of. A 2-year figure when we were discussing the Grenfell Tower offers of relocation, the 2-year figure suddenly made perfect sense as he explained it, so we'll benefit some more from the fruits of his expertise and experience after the news. Phone lines are open, but equally, if you are from Wandsworth Council and you don't like the way you're being represented, feel free to ring me. We can have a little chinwag. 0345 606 0973. Ditto Tower Hamlets Council if the story that Conwell told us doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Ditto whatever council covers Crystal Palace if that story there about leaseholders being offered around £300,000 for their flats but told that they'd need £575,000 to move back into the redeveloped area. And of course, if you happen to know any of the Malaysian businessmen behind this consortium that's effectively printing money on the south bank of the River Thames under the guise of redeveloping the Battersea Power Station, then I'll bite your arm off for a conversation. But at risk of mixing my metaphors, I won't be holding my breath. It's 11:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Here's the thing. Actually, I'll tell you in a minute because James has been kept on hold. Remind me what the job description is, James, when you're in charge of relocating or decanting people from a big estate.
Well, I mean, I was acting as project director, but I had teams below me doing that work, and obviously I had to keep my eyes on it.
Yes.
But as I said to you, I have stood in front of public meetings with all residents prior to a scheme commencing, but I've also stood... You have a separate set of meetings with the leaseholders, the owners.
Right.
If I said to you... I heard a couple of leaseholders earlier. We must remember, James, that they have made significant profits on a discounted home.
Yes, that's true.
Let's not forget that.
They possibly have. They might be the second or third owners of that home, and in which case the significant profits would really have been accrued at the first selling point.
Well, absolutely, I do agree with. I understand that, but let's be clear too. Most of them don't live in these blocks anymore. They are rented. They're rented out at market rents.
Yes, but again, you're turning me into a hair splitter, James. But the likelihood of the buy-to-let landlord being the original exerciser of the right to buy option is pretty low. I mean, usually the buy-to-let landlord scenario comes in after the original purchaser has sold it on.
You'd be surprised, actually.
Well, I wouldn't, because I know there's one, because he happens to be the son of one of the Conservative ministers who was responsible for bringing in right to buy, and he's got an enormous portfolio of buy-to-let properties. That's the fella. But anyway, you carry on. You're right. The phenomenon exists. We're not going to argue about how big the phenomenon is.
Okay, but if I could just say to you there, of course, once right to buy is established in a block like Grenfell, and well done on that, by the way, keep it up. We mustn't lose sight of it.
Damn right.
I still think we need a London housing summit, James.
Yes, you're not wrong.
And as the scales fall from your eyes, I think you're beginning to see exactly what's been going on, and professionals have been living with for the last 30 years as they've seen this process accelerate. The fact of the matter is, right to buy was the Trojan horse.
Right.
That changed the relationship between the local authority and its residents in those buildings, fundamentally. And in fact, I'd have to say that leaseholders became more important politically, even in Labour authorities, than the tenants did. Now, that's my view. Others may disagree with it.
Sure.
But here, pardon me.
Take your time.
Pardon me. Here's the rub. We have moved, even on land owned by councils, and the mayor
Yes.
For example, Greenwich Peninsula, the last 2 phases there, reduced affordable housing, subject to a viability statement. So even on land owned by us through the mayor,
yes,
we are accepting, and this is now a Chinese consortium on Greenwich Peninsula, where we've cleaned up the land at our cost, prepared everything for development, and done a deal, and it was 35% affordable housing on there, with at least 20% social housing.
Right.
That now has been reduced on the last 2 phases to something like 7 or 8% social housing.
And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say the developer turns around and says, if you don't let us reduce what we promised to do when you gave us permission to build this development, we're going to, you're digging into our profits so much, we're just going to down tools and go away.
Yeah, we're going to mothball it or we'll sell it on. There'll be no activity. Okay, so then we have lowly paid planners with leaders of the council and chief executives who move in that world.
Yes, of course they do.
Who will not want to lose the kudos either to another borough or London-wide and get themselves taken out of the news.
Which is where the competition comes in.
Absolutely. But the bottom line is this. On council estates, we are now witnessing, on those 60 or 70 estates, just do the maths on this. You start with, as I did, 300 homes. Over half are right to buy. So they're gone. You've got 150 then. You've got 50% social housing on the estate.
Yeah.
You then go to planning, and the mayor or the GLA planners will force you to double the number of units on that site. Density and because of homelessness and demand for housing. So, okay, away you go. They will also force you, the law will also force you to get what's called best consideration for that land, and that normally means money.
Yes.
So you ram them in, you ram the units up. This is on an ex-council estate. You may double the number of homes. I've been there twice on this. And what you end up with is what you don't replace the right to buy homes as social housing. They're gone. You're only replacing what's left as a rented housing if you're lucky. And in many cases, not even they are fully replaced. So when we look at this hierarchy of displacement, you start with right to buy.
God, yeah.
You in a sense, you create different communities on the estate with different interests.
Of course.
And interestingly enough,
that's divide and rule. And is it deliberate or is it just circumstantial?
It's fatalism and lack of courage, and in some instances political will.
And a bit of forelock tugging to big money as well.
Once the doors open, James, then they're the people who come in, and then you get a different accent on the people who work for councils, who interface with the private sector, who sound very like the people from the private sector and are comfortable in their company and are comfortable in their salaries.
Yes, of course.
With these people. So I do have, my main sympathy is this, that what we're going to lose, we can't all be key workers. There will be low-paid people in low-paid employment who are either going to be in right to buy leasehold flats, earning leaseholders quite a lot of money in certain parts of London, or we have homes where ordinary folk who literally cannot afford to buy at these prices, we all know, they're hell in a handcart.
Yes.
The fact we're talking about £400,000 for an ex-council flat in that block has got to be nothing more than obscene.
You're on the money. I mean, all right, briefly, because there's a lot of people waiting, and you've had a fantastic run, which is a credit to the quality of your contribution.
Okay.
Briefly, how has it been allowed to happen, do you think? As you mentioned, a 30-year window, you posit the idea of right to buy as being the foundation stones of the whole heist, I'm going to call it, I think. How has it gone unremarked? Is it the usual kind of supine media, disinterested public, and also the kind of successful, almost the dehumanising of these people? So, we've somehow turned social housing tenants into pariahs. There's a presumption abroad that they were all, what is it that they say, the flat screen tellies and the 40 a day Benson and Hedges or whatever it is. Or is it more subtle than that?
Look, I think it's more subtle, but I think what you've got to understand is in the same period, and you and I have spoken about this before, I am actually studying a PhD. I've been 35 years in the industry, and this is something that's coming out through my studies. The fact of the matter is this was combined with the deregulation of the financial industry.
Yeah, of course it was.
So, of course, nobody was looking to get a council flat because you could get money for nothing to buy something.
Yeah.
And so you didn't look back there, and you hoped you would never have to look back there.
And then when you needed it and you looked for it, it had gone.
Absolutely. And, of course, when the crash came, the bailout went to the banks and property and not to the people living, the council tenants, still council tenants, paid their rent for 30 years. They're the people who are suffering these conditions. Most of the leaseholders aren't, James.
No, of course they're not. They're leaseholders of the capital, aren't they? So, not to get too Marxist about it, but the capital gets looked after and the workers just whistle for it.
Well, I'm not political, but I'm simply saying...
Yeah, you are.
As someone who...
You're not party political. We're all political, James.
Well, of course. But what I'm saying to you are facts.
Yeah, I know.
This is what's happened. And the blocks that Ian Gow's son owns in Roehampton were ex-council homes. And we have to ask ourselves how we've allowed this to happen, where people with families now are dependent on the private rented sector, where you can be anybody. You don't even have to be registered with anybody. Even your vet has qualifications after
You mean to be a landlord? You can be anybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
This now, Grenfell, as I say, should, to do these people justice and their children and the next generation, we professionals have to put our hand up and get the whistleblowing going that should have been going years ago. Of course, many people were disregarded and called lefties.
I was about to say, that's the other part of the process, isn't it? Is to deride anybody saying... Because what you've described is a deregulation of the financial market, a gerrymandering of the property situation, but it could only have worked if you could shout down the people pointing it out. And how do you shout down the people pointing it out? Champagne socialist, politics of envy, you don't understand business, we need less regulation. It's all a bit Brexity, actually, when you put it like that.
It is, and you will find that I don't see in this viability, as you just come back to that finally for you. How on earth, when the pound is cheaper, foreign buyers are loving it. To get into...
Yes, of course they are. Of course they are, but not necessarily... Yeah, because the Malaysian businessmen will be raising their money not in sterling, will they?
No, and the prices haven't fallen.
It's the contempt, isn't it? They send this out. The £1.8 billion figure being widely quoted in the media refers to a viability study written in 2008. Which, you're too thick to understand this. Tuck your forelock, jog along and leave it to the big boys. That's what they're saying in these press releases.
Well, watch this space. We'll talk again.
We will, you're right.
I'm saying to you, we're 50-50. We're walking on a ledge of a major correction.
I think you're right.
In housing.
I think you're right. I didn't understand what you meant when you first told me that. I genuinely didn't. I may, to my shame, have pretended that I did, but I promise you that I do now.
Well, we will talk again. I'd leave you with one last thing.
Go on.
Look up The Secret of Our Streets. The Secret of Our Streets. It's a series on the BBC. And have a look at the one on Portland Street. Have a look what it was and what it has now become.
You're on.
And I assure you, it will be very enlightening to you how how council housing was built, and the slums that were emptied of those people turned into the bankers' mansions of today.
I shall watch it with interest. The Secrets of Our Streets. James, you are a gentleman and a scholar. Now, when's the thesis going to be finished?
Ooh, don't get on my back on that.
Well, don't start. Turn your radio off.
3 years.
3 years, all right. Start the clock. It's 11:46. I'll read you a text. It's perhaps a little bit I don't know, self-aggrandising, but it'll give you a flavour of how I'm feeling as a listener to the programme rather than the person speaking on it. It's from Peter, who just says, I've listened to your show since before the FEFEF days. You've got to be quite a committed listener to know what he's referring to. Yes, the FEFEF days. Answers on a postcard, please. This is groundbreaking stuff, James. I knew we were getting screwed. Thank you for the proof. That's how I feel. 11:51 is the time, talking about social cleansing and apologising for not realising the scale on which it was already unfolding right in front of us. Terry is in Sidcup. A lot of Sidcup callers today. Terry, what would you like to say?
I'd just like to, give my sort of personal experience of...
Good man.
I moved on to the Haygate estate, which has been under discussion. 1974, James. That's when it was actually built.
Right, this is the one in Elephant and Castle.
The one at the Elephant and Castle, which has now been rebranded by the developers as Elephant Park.
Elephant Park.
Yeah. I lived on the estate up to 2008. There were just short of 3,000, I think just over 3,000 people living on the estate.
Yes.
And to my knowledge, there's just been over 80 residents or tenants that have been rehoused in the area under affordable rent, or so-called affordable rent.
82, I think, yeah.
Yeah. Now, my...
What happened to you then? Were you there as a tenant? Were you a council tenant?
I initially was a council tenant, and I've got my own views of whether I should have taken up the right to buy.
Sure.
I thought I can't take a selfish view anymore. I've got a family to consider.
Yes.
I was getting on in years, so I thought I went for the right to buy in 1986. When it came to redeveloping the actual estate, there was a poll put out among the tenants and residents, and I would emphasise there was no actual split.
Sure.
Conflict of interest between the tenants and residents, because actually we all thought as one, and I thought we all had the same experience we were going to go through. So there was never animosity between the two of us.
Okay,
when it got to the point of how can I say rehousing through their project team, the tenants. In the main, and I think I'm correct from the latest figures, were actually moved out to existing council properties scattered throughout the borough.
Right.
And when it came down to the actual leaseholders...
Like you.
Like me, this is the best illustration. I wasn't the worst treated, but there were many other examples, but I'll give you the actual figure I was offered. I was offered $172,000 for a three-bedroom masonette that was built in 1978. Now, I got an independent surveyor, as we were entitled to under the law ruling at the time.
Yes.
My independent surveyor valued the property at $228,000.
Gosh.
But it got to the point where she's turned around to me and said, well, Mr. Redpath, I'm doing the best I can, but unfortunately my company, as big as it is, hasn't got the resources to fight the council's legal department.
Which the council knew.
Yeah, which the council knew. And at that point, point in time, at 2008, mid-2008, the market was taking a slight dip.
Of course it was. Well, the global financial crisis came along just in time for you, didn't it, Terry?
And she said, well, they've got you over the barrel, Mr. Redpath.
Oh,
she said,
mate.
unfortunately, I've got to tell you this. If you don't take the $172,000, they're going to come back and revalue at God knows what price.
Well, you think they might have rounded it down because of the recession?
Absolutely. Yeah, she was... absolutely.
And what if you just refused to move? What if you handcuffed yourself to the radiators? Then what happens?
Well, because I had a sort of a family, I had to consider them against my principles. There were 4 that held on. In fact, and one of them, who didn't get his under right to buy, he bought his on the open market.
Yes.
With a local teacher, barricaded himself in, and bailiffs forced him out of the home.
In Britain, in the late 20th century, dragged out of a home he thought he'd bought.
In actual fact, there's evidence of it, visual evidence
I'm sure.
on YouTube of the actual,
I'm sure. I wonder what we were getting cross about at the time. Probably fish.
Yeah. So we ended up. I was actually at my wit's end. Where am I going to move my family?
Oh,
my son had to hold.
So just to jump ahead a little bit, if you'd wanted to buy a place in the redeveloped Elephant Park, how much would that have cost you? A similar place? Do you know?
Rub salt into the wounds.
Go on.
I had an email from the. Am I allowed to mention the developers?
Yeah.
Right, they're Lend-Lease.
Yes.
Australian corporation. They sent me an email, would I be interested in a one-bedroom or studio flat in the Elephant Park development, 550,000.
No!
On the exact footprint of where my three-bedroom masonette was demolished.
That they'd just given you 173,000 for.
Yeah, from the local authority. Now, I would add to that, another bone of contention for me, local Southwark councillors, plus the chair of housing,
yes,
and council officers. 1 minute they're fighting in our camp, getting us the best deal. And what we term the revolving doors policy.
Yeah.
I think there's a dozen at last count, and now working for developers.
You hear this? You hear this a lot. You've only given us a number, you haven't given us names, so that's fine, and we're happy to correct that if it's wrong. But
names are actually on.
I'm sure they are, and you hear that a lot, don't you? You hear an awful lot about people who used to be working on the ones, poachers turned gamekeepers, isn't it? Or gamekeepers turned poachers, actually.
And that estate, I know we've got this stigma about council estates, but I wouldn't have wished to live anywhere other. The kids grew up there, and that estate was home to people working in a local hospital as cleaners, people working on public transport. And they're scattered far and wide, the leaseholders. In many cases, I know people haven't been able to take out another property. They've ended up renting, and they've blown all the money.
And that's it. The money they raised has gone up in smoke, or rather, it's gone into buying another property for someone who was already rich enough to be a buy-to-let landlord. Terry, what did you do, if you don't mind me asking? I had
to sort of caution the wind. I thought, well, the only way we're going to get a roof on our head, we moved down here. Yeah. We've got a property that was in need of repair. 180,000. We had to spend. I gave up the job. I took early retirement, so the money I got from the early retirement, lumped that together. Yeah. So all our life savings was blown just to keep a roof over our heads in an area I didn't particularly want to be in.
Well, 2 hours we've been talking about this, and you, in many ways, have distilled the entire conversation into a 4 or 5 minute story. The final question I'd like to ask you is more about your feelings than your experiences. On two levels: what you've been through, how that made you feel, and the fact that nobody seemed to be reporting it or caring about it. How did that make you feel?
Absolutely livid. I mean, still to this day, I'm raising issues through Facebook pages about how people were turned over. And I know friends of mine are still campaigning. Can I mention their campaign?
Yeah, you can.
They're making all these figures. It's called 35% campaign. It's in the public domain, and every opportunity they're turning up facts and figures about what the council are accepting from the developers. In my opinion, the people are not fit for purpose working in local authorities because the developers turn them over wholesale.
And I don't know, I'll check the numbers, but as I read into the elephant story, I think Lend-Lease paid the council 50 million quid for the development, and the council spent 44 million quid on rehousing people.
Totally correct. And the land value estimated at the time was 150 million.
I don't get it. But I do know what Occam's razor is. Usually the simplest available explanation for any set of circumstances that you're trying to unravel will be the correct one. Terry, God bless you, mate, and thank you.